In her book, The Gifts of Imperfection, Brené Brown highlights different paths or guideposts to what she calls wholehearted living. With guidepost number 9, she promotes the cultivation of calm and stillness in the midst of our stressful and sometimes anxiety-provoked lives. I wonder if that is what Elijah was searching for as he headed out on his own into the vast desert wilderness, fearing for his life after the threats of Queen Jezebel. You see, she was not of the Jewish faith and in fact was doing her best to encourage her subjects to worship her god, Baal. Elijah, one of the only prophets of Yahweh who survived the deadly annihilation by Queen Jezebel, was on the run. In return for the massacre of his colleagues in prophecy, Elijah had called upon Yahweh for the equal decimation of the religious leaders of the Baal faith. The queen was out for Elijah's head, and so he skipped town and was making it across the wilderness on his own. Yet when he was exhausted and famished, angels attended to his needs, providing him with food and water. Elijah himself was content just to perish in the wilderness rather than face the wrath of Jezebel. To quietly pass away in the night might have seemed a welcome relief to the stress of being on the run and awaiting certain execution. And so we meet Elijah in that point of his 40-day journey, weary, frightened, anxious, and awaiting certain death in a cave on the mountain of Horeb, God's mountain. Elijah is told to stand at the mountain in the presence of God, for he is told God will pass by. And Elijah stands in God's presence, and first a powerful wind tears the mountains apart and shatters rocks, but apparently that wasn't the Lord. And then an earthquake comes and fires burn all around him, but apparently that wasn't the Lord either. But after all of these demonstrations of power and might and destruction, it was in a gentle whisper that God speaks to Elijah. He stood firm in the powerful winds. He didn't cringe when the fires roared and burned around him. Yet when God's presence came in a gentle whisper, Elijah pulled his cloak over his face and met God in that quiet, still voice. And God spoke to Elijah, asking what he was doing, why he was there, and what had been going on in his life. And God speaks to Elijah and tells him what he is to do next. He must return to Damascus, anoint a new king over Elam and Israel, and anoint his successor, Elisha. There was to be a new order, and Elijah was basically putting the right people on the bus and getting the wrong people off the bus so that God's plan could come to be. Elijah went in search of peace, stillness, and reprieve from what had become an anxious time in his life. And yet in that wilderness, he was nurtured and ultimately met the Holy One in a quiet whisper. And that voice spoke to Elijah of a new order of things, a new hope for the people of Israel. Brené Brown, in her book, suggests that to cultivate stillness, we must create space. She describes stillness as not about focusing on nothingness, but rather it's about creating a clearing. It's opening up an emotionally clutter-free space and allowing ourselves to feel and think and dream and even question. I would suggest that that is what Elijah did. By running away into that wilderness, he in fact created space for himself to think, to question, and ultimately become a new part of God's dream for God's people. I think we all know how challenging it is to create this kind of space to feel and think and dream and question. Sometimes we're just in such a friendly, we can hardly think straight at all. We all have full schedules, but we need to recognize the importance of set aside this time to allow ourselves some space, sometimes just to breathe. It might mean creating space in our lives. It might mean slowing down. It might mean taking a vacation or a hiatus from something we normally do. It might mean doing things we've usually done, but in a different way. It might even mean giving up for a time. But trust that angels will tend to our needs and provide us with what we need to get up and going again. It's not easy, but it's so vital to our wholeness and well-being. Creating space means connecting with the world around us and one another. It's understanding that there really is no us and them. It's we and us. Creation, all of us, sacred in this space we call Earth, our home. No one knows this better than our Indigenous sisters and brothers. Friday was the celebration of Indigenous Day here in Canada. And Indigenous cultures have always understood the sacred times and spaces in their lives. In a recent article in Sojourners that Reverend John brought to my attention, Randy Woodley writes that knowing ourselves as a people connected to the land is perhaps the single most glaring difference between an Indigenous worldview and a Euro-Western worldview. He highlights how Jesus understood humanity's relationship with the earth differently than we do. He reminds us of how Jesus spoke to the wind, to the water, and to the trees, closely observed the habits of the birds and the flowers and the animals, and often used their ways as metaphors and teachings for our own lives. Jesus understood as a person of faith it was important to be keen observers of the world in which we live and to understand how God was alive and at work in creation all around us. And so Woodley concludes that to Jesus, as it should be to us, the earth is wholly spiritual, as are our bodies. Had Elijah not created space, looked for and found God on Mount Horeb, God's mountain, there may not have been a new order and the dreams of God's people brought forward. Our Indigenous people are crying out for Western thinkers to stop and listen to what the earth is trying to tell us once again. As followers of Jesus, I hope we have a head start in appreciating how God speaks to us and through creation. We are called to work with Creator to maintain Earth's balance. We are called to listen for God's presence and whispering voice. In Job chapter 12, it says, "But ask the animals what they think. Let them teach you. Let the birds tell you what's going on. Put your ear to the earth. Learn the basics. Listen. The fish in the ocean will tell you their stories. Isn't it clear that they all know and agree that God is sovereign, that God holds all things in God's hands? Every living soul, yes, every breathing creature?" Woodley concludes that the road to restoration for our planet is for Christians to take on the responsibility of earth care that we have often evaded as we have bought into the philosophy and influences of our Western ways that sometimes promote hierarchy, individualism, racism, greed, triumphalism, to name a few. But instead, he encourages us as followers on the ways of Jesus to understand their relationship with creation as critical to the abundant life God intends for all humanity. Indigenous people understand that to be human is to care for creation, and that if we want to live our lives together in abundance and harmony and preserve that way of life for future generations, that we must see our faith journey involving living ways that bring healing and wholeness to our broken and damaged world. Woodley highlights how Indigenous beliefs parallel many of our Christian beliefs. Together, we believe that creation exists because of a creator. Life is intrinsically valuable because it is a gift of Creator, and therefore it is sacred. He also writes that the role of human beings is unique and that we relate to the rest of creation uniquely. He suggests we all act toward creation in ways that restore harmony through acts of gratitude, reciprocity, and ceremony between Creator, one another, and all parts of creation. He believes that there is an ongoing dialogue or discourse between creation and Creator all around us. And like Elijah, We need to take the time on God's mountain to listen and see God face to face. We need to create those sacred spaces in our lives in order to listen to God's whispering voice. Like our Indigenous sisters and brothers, we need to reclaim our own voices to speak on behalf of creation. And Woodley gives us a call to speak up. He says, we are in relationship with the earth and all of Earth's creation. We must make the earth's voice known and protect it, to be recognizing the earth's rights. Unfortunately, we have waited until this late hour to realize the sacredness of this relationship. Let's not delay until it is too late. We must all take the time to seek God, the sacred, and listen to that calm, still whisper that offers us new ways of living and moving forward. That still, calm whisper that calls to hear the cries of our earth and its brokenness. That still, calm voice that reminds us that we are all part of creation and even ourselves in need of reconciliation and healing. Elijah went in search of peace, stillness, and reprieve from what had become an anxious and life-threatened way. Brene Brown suggests that to cultivate stillness, we must create space, that sacred space. And it's about creating a clearing. It's opening up an emotionally clutter-free space and allowing ourselves to feel and think and dream and question. And it's the connection between ourselves, Creator, and all of creation that our Indigenous people remind us is sacred. So let us listen and dream together and act in ways that might bring that peace and healed world where we can all live together as God intended. Amen.